Today I'm going to be talking about the three-dimensional healing model of old World of Warcraft, the old healing model, how that became the two-dimensional healing model, and then how eventually that resulted in the one-dimensional healing model, especially at the highest level. I'm also going to be discussing how I see this shift as one of the main causes for the one-shot meta we currently have, the defensive power creep that's been going on now for a couple of years, and the stressful healing meta that has turned a lot of healers away from healing. This is going to somewhat tie into what a lot of the other race to world first streamers or content creators have been talking about, as well as videos from Theon, I think that's how you pronounce his name, on Wowhead, talking about the problems with raid healing at the moment in Dragonflight and why it isn't just a simple fix. I see a lot of people effectively arguing that Blizzard just have to slow down how much health bars move, reduce the spikiness of mechanics damage, healers complaining about very complicated or complex dispel mechanics in raids in particular, and how effectively, because of the changes I'm going to be talking about and the shift to the one-dimensional healing model, how fixing any of those problems isn't really feasible without a lot more fundamental changes happening. It isn't just a matter of Blizzard making healers weaker and making mechanics weaker. I don't think that's going to fix the problem. I'm going to begin by covering what healing was like in the past. This is from pretty much vanilla to Legion, and it was a three-dimensional healing model. Two of those dimensions are types of healing or categories of healing that everyone is familiar with, and that is unavoidable damage, mechanics damage, and then avoidable damage, so failure damage. But from vanilla to Legion, WoW also had another type of unavoidable damage, and that was tank damage. In raids or dungeons, tanks weren't self-sufficient. They needed healing from a healer to stay alive. So, of those three dimensions, we'll start with the first one, and that is what we would today call unavoidable damage, mechanics damage. Now, for the life of World of Warcraft, all of those kind of mechanics unavoidable damaging events have almost always been sporadic. They can be sporadic or infrequent in different ways. Sometimes it could be a mechanic goes off every 25% of a boss's health bar, or maybe on a fixed 30-60 second timer or something, or when an energy bar reaches 100, or every fourth cast does mega damage, or whatever it is. All of those kind of unavoidable mechanics damage events were always sporadic, or at least maybe I should say 99% of them have been sporadic, because maybe one or two bosses per expansion there's some kind of omnipresent sustained continual damaging mechanic, but that's been very rare. But the point is that 99% of mechanics in the game were mechanics that were sporadic, that healers had to heal up. But then between those damaging events, the question was, what exactly do healers do? What is the role of healers when they're not healing up damage from those sporadic, unavoidable damaging mechanics? Because that's the important question, and that's what changed. You see, prior to Legion, the answer to that question was, well, healers healed up the tank. So prior to Legion, healing as a role, like I said, was three-dimensional, right? Healers were responsible for healing up the unavoidable damage that the group took from mechanics, the unavoidable damage that the tank took from auto attacks, melee swings, whatever, and failure damage. Now this could be failure damage from anyone, so there's a little bit of overlap here, right? Maybe the tank is playing a little bit sloppy, or they're under-geared, or they've pulled too many things or whatever, and there's extra failure damage that needs to be healed going into the tank, but also the group. So still three dimensions. Two types of unavoidable damage and failure damage, avoidable damage. And healers had to become proficient in all three of those dimensions. So a fair bit of being a good healer was being good at spinning plates, so to speak, the ability to know which dimension of healing to focus on at which time, and the ability to kind of swap between them, and how to do all of that efficiently. It also allowed for quite a bit of diversification, I guess you could say, ability for healers to be different, because all healers handled those 3 dimensions a little bit differently. Some handled multiple at once, like Holy Paladins with their beacon. They could tank heal and they could group heal, or they could heal failure damage or whatever. Others did those dimensions one at a time, and they were built around shifting between those dimensions quickly, or like Mistweavers with Chi, choosing between AoE healing with Uplift or tank healing with Enveloping. It allowed for those abilities to be very powerful because Mistweavers couldn't do them both at once. You had to either AoE heal or tank heal or single target heal. The reduction of healing dimensions has also led to the homogenization of healers because they effectively all just focus on mechanics now, so they all have to handle mechanics effectively the same way. I'll get to that a little bit later when I talk about all of the kind of negative impacts and results that this change has had. But I want to also talk about exactly what changed, how the 3rd dimension of healing was effectively removed in Legion. And that's because in Legion, tanks changed. You see, in early days, tanking wasn't about survivability. Like tank players, the tank role, it wasn't about staying alive. It was about generating and keeping threat, keeping aggro on mobs. But over time, tanking had shifted away from that. And I would say that pretty much culminated in Legion, which is why I'm using Legion as the kind of end point of this, because in Legion, tanks were self-sufficient for the most part. They would no longer live or die by their healer, but instead live or die by their own gameplay. They got self-healing abilities and stronger defensives and powerful mitigation and avoidance talents and things like that, that meant they had almost complete control over their health bar. If they died, it was the result of their own failure, and it was on them. Healers could still be useful by helping undergeared or underplayed tanks survive, but the onus was ultimately on the tanks to live. And the good ones, the geared ones with all the right trinkets and setups and knew what they were doing, they didn't need healers at all. And that is still true today. So while I'm talking about all of this, it's probably helpful for me to mention that everyone's experience is going to be a little bit different. I'm tailoring most of this discussion towards the kind of higher end of players and content, because I know that right now, if I logged in and signed up for a +7 key, I'd probably have to do a fair bit of tank healing. Maybe that's a similar story at a +17. Probably still have to do some tank healing, but I know as soon as I get into like the +27 range, I'm not touching the tank at all. The tank doesn't need healing whatsoever. It's effectively on them. What this change also did was it shifted the limit of content away from the tank and onto the group. Mythic dungeons or raids even became more of an issue of how well could the group survive rather than how well could the tank survive. This is the part of the story where our first real problem emerges from the post-Legion model, or the healing role in general. And that is, what exactly do healers do when they're not healing up damage from those sporadic damaging events? Now, the initial answer to that was damage. Healers do damage now from Legion onwards when they're not healing. But the real answer to that was actually that no one knew, not even Blizzard, because healers were never really designed to do damage or have damage be like an integral part of their gameplay. Healers were given damage abilities so that they could level as a healer or in a healer specialization after an expansion launched, or so they could participate in like casual content like completing world quests or something. And that meant that healers had abysmally bad damage dealing gameplay. Like a lot of healers, especially back in Legion after this shift occurred, a lot of healers' damage gameplay was like 2 buttons or 3 buttons, literally like nothing else. Just you press this button 57 times between healing events. That was pretty much it for a lot of specs. And what's worse is that balance was a complete mess, right? Some healers had AoE abilities, some healers didn't. Some healers had abilities that they could just press once and get like a lot of damage out of, and other healers had to only do damage 1 global at a time, right? Like paladins with their consecration and druids with their sunfire that spread to every enemy. I mean, that's like BFA dungeons in one of the major balancing issues with the entire expansion for healers was that some healers could do AoE damage and some healers couldn't. And Blizzard hadn't quite like cottoned on to this being a dimension for balance. So the whole damage dealing aspects of healers was a mess. Now, some healers were happy to spend their time between healing mechanic events, the sporadic events, by doing damage. Others saw that time as time to recover from avoidable damage or mistakes being made, or to play safely and preemptively, or using abilities or fishing for procs just to get cooldowns back. And yet others saw that time as time to relax and AFK almost, like if there's nothing to heal, I don't press my buttons. In most cases, at least, what healers were doing between the sporadic damaging events wasn't healing, and that meant it was divisive. Like healers today still argue about this. The second problem was one of balance that has led us to where we are today with the one-shot meta, the spiky health bars, the stressful gameplay for healers, the defensive power creep that's been going on for a couple of years now and plaguing all aspects of the game. And I want to reiterate this a couple of times to try and get the point across, because this is effectively the point of the whole video, and I'm just explaining things to get to this point. So in the past, if you were in a group, raid, dungeon, whatever, there were two types of damage that you were, as a healer, dealing with or responding to. And that is the damage that the tank was taking, and that is the damage that the group was taking, mechanics damage, right? And then maybe there's some failure damage mistakes on top of that, but those were the main two things you were grappling with. Now, the advantage of this was that it meant that a significant portion of the healing you were doing was set almost. It was predictable. You knew the target it was going into, or the damage was going into that you needed to heal, the tank, and you had a pretty good idea, especially as a dungeon or a raid went on or whatever, you had a pretty good idea of how that tank was going to handle that or deal with that. So a considerable amount of your power as a healer was going into an aspect of healing that was a known quantity for the most part. It wasn't particularly stressful because you knew pretty much what was going to happen. And then the other category of healing you were doing was mechanics. Now, those mechanics never had to be super powerful or like giga dangerous, kills you in 2 ticks of a dot like we have today, because a lot of the throughput or power, mana, globals, decision making, everything was already, like a lot of that budget, so to speak, was already being taken up by tank healing. So mechanics could be difficult because mechanics always had to be healed while doing something else. But post-Legion, with tank healing effectively off the menu, healers now only worried about mechanics or mistakes. And that meant that all of the damage required to challenge the healer or healers in a raid, all of their cooldowns, all of their mana bar or their mana management, all of their decision making, all of their like global to global gameplay and just rotational normal healing, everything now had to just be challenged by mechanics, because avoidable damage couldn't be counted on. Blizzard couldn't make mechanics that don't kill players unless they also make a mistake. They had to make mechanics that are dangerous, but now they had really only one dimension to make that dangerous. Which is why I think the whole discussion that's been going on now for most of Dragonflight about how spiky raid damage mechanics in particular are, and a lot of the raiders don't like it, I feel like that discussion is very shallow and missing a crucial kind of point here, because those mechanics are the only thing Blizzard has to kill players. Of course they have to be dangerous. They're the only thing that healers are going to focus on when those mechanics go out. Of course they have to be powerful, right? Like if you're Blizzard and you're designing raid mechanics, like damaging mechanics for a mythic 20-man raid with 4 or 5 healers in them, when those mechanics go out, Blizzard have to expect that 4 players are now going to devote all of their focus into handling those mechanics and nothing else, right? They're going to press their cooldowns, they're going to spend their mana, they're going to do whatever they have to do to keep those players alive because they have nothing else to do. Blizzard have to account for excellent players. They have to assume that, especially like if you're talking about the highest level content in the game, the last few bosses of a mythic raid, that all of the like high level raiders are complaining about right now as being too bursty, Blizzard have to design those bosses under the assumption that they're going to avoid as much damage as possible, which means the only damage those raids are going to take is from unavoidable damaging mechanics. They have to be spiky, they have to be bursty. You see, in the past, Blizzard had the ability to dial up the amount of damage that had to be healed, so they could stress healers' mana bars more, their cooldowns more, their rotational throughput more, without making mechanics more dangerous. This is another thing that I think is somewhat missing from the the healing discussion right now about raids in particular being too spiky. Is I remember like way back in the day, raids would pretty much always bring at least one holy paladin, sometimes even two, just to handle tank healing. But that also meant that instead of bringing 4 or 5 like AoE raid healers to the group, they really only had like 2, maybe 3. Because paladins couldn't do the raid healing that other healers could do, but they could do tank healing really well. So going back and watching videos from like Cataclysm, and you look at like how much a raid's health bar moved, that was partly because there were less healers that were healing the raid. But today all of that is effectively gone. Single dimension state of healing, especially at the highest levels, once like avoidable damage is kind of taken out of the equation and you're left with really just mechanics damage healing. That's what gets us to the point where we can go into a dungeon and a debuff goes out every like 4 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever it is, and it 2-ticks players to death from 100%, because there's nothing else to heal. There's nothing else for healers to focus on. The mechanic is designed around every second one being dispelled, and then the healer having to focus all of their attention on healing the alternating debuff. And then as keys get higher, as difficulty ramps up, that ceases to really become an option, and then it's just the healer dispels every second mechanic, and then people press another defensive ability or something to mitigate the alternating debuff. And the fact that that is the sort of thing that is required to push content means, I mean, it's been like that. The Throne of Tides debuff example is one from Dragonflight, but it's been going in that direction for a lot of mechanics for a while. I mean, I think even back to Legion with the Morose fight in Karazhan, you could heal all the Grievous debuffs for a while in like, I guess, normal or average level content, but as soon as you tried to push up to higher levels than that, healing became ineffectual. There wasn't enough healing in the world to heal 5 people with the Grievous debuff. So what groups did instead was they brought whichever DPS classes had ways to completely avoid the mechanics with bubbles or bops or stoneform or whatever to get rid of the bleed, which placed a huge premium on defensives. The DPS or specializations that had the best or the most defensive abilities reigned supreme. They were the best. And then for the past however many years since then, Blizzard have been slowly trying to make sure that every spec has those kind of defensive options. They've been successful with some, less successful with others, but it's the source of the defensive power creep. So this reduction of healing into a one-dimensional role, I think, is the crux of the healer problem that's become apparent in Dragonflight, but really it has been building for the better part of the last decade. Legion is also when I remember healing becoming far more stressful, and this again is due to mechanics. You see, prior to Legion, I would characterize healing as being usually pretty relaxing, especially if you were playing well, and infrequently stressful. Whereas post Legion, I would almost swap that around entirely. I would say healing is now usually stressful and infrequently relaxing. The dangerous part of pulling an extra pack of mobs in a dungeon used to be the few seconds it took for the tank to notice, hopefully, that it had happened and to round up all the mobs and pick up aggro. And so long as the healer could prioritize healing into the tank, or the tank could press cooldowns to make that an easier job for the healer to handle, then the pull was fairly controlled and relaxed. But today, a similar situation would just result in too many mobs casting too many abilities, overlapping mechanics, randomly killing players in like a global or 2 or less. Because the limiting factor today for failure isn't the tank's ability to survive, but the group's ability to survive. To generalize a little bit here and to make up some numbers just for the sake of clarity, let's say that pre-Legion healing was 50% about tank healing, and that could mean rolling hots or maintaining routine casts at efficient or opportune times, or weaving priority healing spells at good times onto the tank. And the other 50% of healing was responding to mechanics, like dispels or AoE healing the group, or prioritizing healing into a single target, or recovering from a mistake. Healing wasn't just about my ability to react quickly as it is now, it was also about my ability to juggle multiple targets, multiple dimensions of healing at the same time. But after Legion, healing was really just about mechanics and my ability to react instantly to them and appropriately to them. When X happens, I press Y. There are quite a lot of other problems that resulted from this shift, this reduction in the dimensions of healing, so to speak, that have happened over the years. So if there's interest for it, I'll make another video discussing a lot of those kind of tangential problems. But the purpose of this video was to just add my 2 cents to try and further the discussion. I'm also not advocating for a complete return to the pre-Legion healing model where tanks were reliant on healers to survive, but something fundamental does have to change. Some other dimension to healing does have to be added or expanded upon or changed in some way to alleviate a lot of the problems we have today. I think there is a middle ground where healers aren't just healing up unavoidable mechanics. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments if you think I'm completely off base here, or just to add your input. And if you've made it this far, thank you for watching, and algorithm stuff.